This is the Digital Agency Insiders Podcast. Inside, you'll learn how to build, grow, and scale your digital marketing agency, all from the comfort of your favorite coffee shop. Let's get started with the show.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Digital Agency Insiders Podcast, a podcast that gives you a little inside peek into how entrepreneurs have built and grown their digital marketing agencies. I am your host, Tabitha Thomas, and thanks for listening. We release new episodes each and every Tuesday, so if you like learning about how digital marketing agencies make their business work, make sure you hit that subscribe button. So today I have with me Andrew Allemann. Andrew is a podcast expert and founder of podcastguest.com. The service is used by over 20,000 people to both find guests for podcasts and for experts to get booked on podcasts. Now, being the mastermind behind such a viable podcast tool in today's market, he should be able to shed some light on a few things for us. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Super excited to have you on here. As we were talking before the show, before we hit the record button, I'm an avid user of the platform, so I'm super excited to actually get an opportunity just to talk to you. So all of our podcasts kind of start the same, and it's what did the path of becoming an entrepreneur look like to you? Is it something that you always knew that you wanted to do, or is it some light that just kind of sparked one day?
You know, I think I've always had the bug, even since when I was a kid. You know, I was the kid in the neighborhood who would go buy candy and, you know, break it down and repackage it, sell it at school, sell it on the bus, that sort of thing. But after college, I got a traditional job. It was right when the dot-com boom was happening. So I had a traditional job for a short period of time. And I'd say the first 5 years after college, I worked for companies. And then I started my own first company in 2005 and kind of went from there. But I started a business in college. I was creating websites and selling them and that sort of thing. So I guess I've always had the bug.
That's awesome.
But I decided to go all out on my own there after a little while after college.
So now just me being curious, does entrepreneurship run in the family, or is it just something new with you?
No, yeah, it really doesn't. It's not something. My dad worked for, a corporate job his entire life, same company. And it's, so it doesn't really run in the family.
I always like asking that because you always have a mix of the two because, and I'm opposite. I'm somebody that grew up with entrepreneurs all around me, and I work for somebody else. So, all right. So, so tell me about podcastguest.com. Why did you even start that particular business itself? And what did the first 6 months look like when you first started it?
So Podcast Guest, I created it because I had my own podcast and I had done about 50 episodes in a similar sort of guest format like we're doing right now. And I kind of tapped my Rolodex. I was out of interesting people to interview that I knew. And so I decided that I needed a way to find new and interesting people. And I looked for a way to do that. And there's some agencies out there that follow kind of the PR agency model that'll help you find guests for your show. But they do cost what you'd expect for a PR agency, $1,000 a month, something like that. So I wanted a free and easy way to find guests, and I couldn't find it. So I created my own platform, and I didn't know what it would become and how it would work, but I started by getting a couple hundred people using it. And the idea here was that it would be an email-based service. So every week I'd send out a list of a handful of podcasts that were looking for guests. And if you were a fit for any of them, you just click a link and pitch yourself to them in a form. And the first week I sent one out, I started to make some matches. Some of the podcasts were getting 5 to 10 pitches, which I thought was a really good start for having a couple hundred people using the service. And then it scaled from there. So I'd say the first 6 months, I was really kind of feeling out how it was working, how to scale, because, any service like this, you need a lot of people on both sides. You need the podcasters and the guests. That's kind of the trick to doing something like this. So it's figuring out what marketing strategies worked. And there was a lot of elbow grease during that period too. I was just literally typing personalized emails to podcasters saying, hey, here's what I'm doing. Do you want to give this a shot?
Yeah. So was it just you, or did you finally bring in help to help with all the emails?
Right. So I did all of the work up front, and now I have someone who puts together my weekly email, because that
Nice.
weekly email goes out to it'll go out to 24,000 people this coming Monday. And so I needed some help there. It was a lot of work.
Yeah.
So I do have someone who helps me with that now.
Yeah, I get those emails each and every Monday. They're always
Great.
great. And that's one of the emails that I actually always open because I'm like, who else he got on there
You
this
know,
week? And it's a variety of different people, which is so interesting.
it is, sports podcasts and business, entrepreneurship, religion, you name it. And it is kind of fun because as soon as I send it out, I know there are a lot of people that send it out the same time every Monday, and they're ready, right? The first
Hmm.
person to submit to a podcast so that they get their attention.
That's awesome. So, what would you say is the key benefit to being a guest on a podcast and relating to your business?
I look at being a guest on a podcast is kind of a speaking opportunity. And so if you picture an auditorium of that podcast audience listening to you, what benefits would you get if you were speaking at, say, a conference or something similar to that? And so a lot of that is building your personal brand for sure. To the extent that you're representing a company, a product or service, of course, even though you don't want to just talk about that company or service the entire time, it's going to be mentioned, right? And
Yeah.
what you do. And so, and podcasts are the audience is very loyal and they really trust the host of the podcast. So being on a podcast is a great way to get an introduction to that audience. And I also look at it for a lot of people as an on-ramp to other types of media. So podcasts are a lot lower risk than a live speaking engagement or a radio interview that's live and might go out to a larger audience. So in some ways I tell people, it's good practice too. If you're trying to become a better speaker and a better interviewee and to get more comfortable in front of people or a camera, podcasts are a fantastic way to do that.
Yeah, something about it not being live just kind of chills you
Big
out just a little
difference.
bit.
Big difference. I know if I say something wrong, it can always be edited out.
So very true. So very true. So the one thing I didn't think to ask just a minute ago was tell me about your podcast. Why did you start that particular one and what's the name of it?
Okay, so are you ready? This is an exciting one. It is
Okay.
about domain names, and it's the Domain Name Wire podcast. So it is a niche. So I
Yeah.
started a blog when my first entrepreneurial thing was in 2005. I started a blog about domain names. And so it's about things like, what GoDaddy's doing and people buying and selling domains. And so I started a podcast about that. I'm getting ready to publish my 300th episode. It's weekly. So about 6 years ago, I started the podcast.
Wow.
And it's there are a lot of interesting people in this business, and so it's fun. It's fun. It's a niche. I get about 1,500 downloads per episode, and if I got a lot more than that, I wonder who else was listening because there just aren't that many people who would be interested in it.
I have to say, that's one thing I absolutely love about podcasting. And obviously not been doing it as long as you have, but I would never have gotten the opportunity to meet some of the people that I've interviewed if it wasn't for podcasting. I mean, maybe some of them
Right.
I would run into at conferences, maybe, but it's definitely made some connections. So that's been incredible for me.
Well, and that's one of the things I tell podcast hosts as to why you should be a podcaster. Some
That
of
was
the
my next
people,
question. Yes, just segueing
why
right
you should
into
be a
it.
podcast. Okay, great. So I think, a lot of people are like, I'm going to have this huge podcast. I'm going to have advertisers, blah, blah, blah. Very few podcasts. The medium podcast has fewer than 200 downloads per episode. So
Mhm.
it's not really something that's going to work for an advertising type model. But one of the big benefits, I think, is that opportunity to have a one-on-one conversation with someone who otherwise wouldn't give you the time, or you wouldn't
Mhm.
have the excuse to reach out to them. So if you reach out to say in your case, the leader of a very successful digital agency, and just say, hey, I'd like to talk to you for 30 minutes and pick your brain. They
Mhm.
might be like, I don't have time. But if you
Yeah.
say, I'd love for you to share your story with my podcast audience, then you're giving something to them, right? And it
Mhm.
also creates structure around that conversation. So I think that that's a key reason to do a podcast. And then, of course, going back to what I said about being a guest, you're speaking in front of this auditorium. Well, as a podcaster, you're speaking in front of this auditorium every week or every month or every day, however often you publish your podcast. So it's a really unique opportunity, I think, to grow your brand.
For sure, for sure. So, being a podcast guest, if you're looking to be on somebody else's podcast, what is more important, the size of the podcast or the fit of the podcast?
I always say the fit. And I think it makes a lot more sense to speak to an audience of a couple hundred people that really care about what you're talking about than to speak to thousands of people that are going to tune it out. And so I recommend people, especially when you're first getting started, just every podcast opportunity that comes to you that seems like a reputable podcast. I recommend doing. It'll give you the practice. You can build it up. You can hone your story and make it better, so that when you get on that big podcast, that one that you really want to land, it's that much better. And podcasters want to see that you've done other podcasts. So even if you're talking to an audience that's very small, or a podcast that you wouldn't otherwise do, that helps build your library of podcasts that you've been on, which is very helpful.
So true. So true. So as a podcaster, how would you go about crafting the perfect pitch to get guests onto your podcast?
So, I think there are a few things that are key here. So one is to explain to your guest who your audience is, to make sure that it is a fit. There are some times where someone will reach out to me and to be a guest on their show. And I'm like, and I couch it like this: I don't want to bore your audience, right? So help me understand how I will be a relevant guest to you. The other thing I would do as a podcaster when you're pitching is to explain the exposure that the person will get. So even if it's a small podcast, focus more on your audience in general. So, hey, I'll tweet this show out to my 5,000 followers, or if you're big on Facebook, that sort of thing, even if your podcast is small. Now, as a host, there are some things too, in addition to pitching, that I would do to make sure that your guest is going to be a good guest. And a lot of that lies on your shoulders as the host. Even though the guest can be good or bad, there are things that you should do to prepare them for success. And so among those things, like what you do, is you give them not necessarily the specific questions you'll ask, but just a high level overview. And certainly if there's something like, if there's some data you want, it's good to kind of prep them for that so they can come prepared with the answer. And also explain to them what sort of technical setup you'll be using. We're doing this over Zoom, which at this point in the pandemic, everyone has used, which is great. But just as an example, my podcasts are audio only, and I record them over Skype. So I tell people what I'll be using them. I tell people to do it in a quiet location. I tell them to wear earbuds or a headset so we get better sound quality. And I explain to them, hey, this will be audio only. So they don't have to do what I did this morning, which is brush my hair, put on a reasonable shirt, that sort of thing.
Well, hey, I warned you on that one.
Just so they're prepared for it. Yeah, and certainly if you're doing video, you want to tell people this will be video, so that they know. So some of that preparation lies on your shoulders as the host. But of course, I tell guests too. In fact, I was so frustrated with hearing from people about having bad guest experiences that I put together a quick guide. You can actually download it at podcastguests.com/guide. And it's like, hey, here's what you need to do to be prepared as a guest. And hopefully that helps out the podcasters as well.
Yeah.
In fact, podcasters, I guess they should just send that to their guests before they show on to say, hey, make sure you do these things so that you're a good guest.
I'm glad that you said that, because there's some things that you mentioned that I definitely do. But as far as talking about, making sure that your mic is good, or you got headphones on, I'm like, I never tell them that because I just assume that they know those things, but maybe it's a good idea to point those out.
You'd be amazed. I'm sure, having done 300 podcasts, I've been in some situations where I'm like, the sound is just not going to work. It's just not going to work. I talked to one podcaster who syndicates out to a radio show, and that the radio network has denied some of his syndication sometimes because he's like, the sound quality is just not good enough. Clearly the person called in on a phone, or they weren't in a quiet location. and they've nixed those shows. So as a guest, if you have better sound quality, you're going to get better syndication, you're going to get invited on more shows as well. And you don't have to spend a lot of money to get good sound.
No.
You know, I don't know what mic you're using, but
Yeti, which is not that
sure.
expensive. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for 40, $50 on Amazon, you can get a decent microphone. And then you can get things like these, you know, little foam things and put them around you to get better sound quality. You can even, one of the hacks I like, if you're not doing video, is you can record it in your walk-in clothing closet, and the clothes just absorb all the echo.
That's the one thing I have to say. My wood wall behind me, which is beautiful. My husband made this for me. I love it, but it can it has a little bit of an effect on my audio. So
a little bit of an echo.
So continuing on to this, so what would you say are the top 3 mistakes that podcasters make when they're selecting a guest?
They not doing their homework on that guest, and this is something that, you know, there's homework in a couple ways. So one of them is, you know, making sure that they will sound good on the podcast, that they won't go blabbing on forever. And you can do that by listening to a little bit of their previous podcasts. Another thing I do when you're doing your homework on the guest is to check their audio quality and how they sound. And another thing that, this is tricky, but you know, there are people out there that have non-mainstream views, negative views, you know, that sort of thing too, that depending on your podcast topic, you might want to do a little bit of homework on them and make sure they're not, you know, an extremist or something along those lines. You're not going to run into that very much with, say, your show.
Yeah, no.
But depending on the topic, that can be an issue.
Yeah.
I would select guests that can help you grow your show. And this is something that I was at a South by Southwest in Austin, and I was speaking to a podcaster, and he said, I get pitched all the time by guests, and they're always pitching about what I as the host can do for them, but they never tell me what they can do for me. And I want to grow my show. What can they do for me? So when you actually, for those that do the paid option at podcastguest.com, and they create a one sheet, one of the things that they say is what they will do to help promote the show after they are on it. And so that can be promoting it to social media, out to their email list. And those are things like, for example, when I'm on a show like this, I will then include it in one of my newsletters, which goes out to 24,000 people, which I assume to you is a good thing, right? As the host, someone clicks through, they might subscribe to the show. It helps grow the show. So think about that as well. And sometimes the smaller guests or the less well-known guests can be the best at promoting your show. And so that's something to think about. Even if their audience is smaller, I've had people tell me they had some big name guest on, and that guest didn't do anything, right? Because they moved on to the next thing. Whereas the up and coming guest, if you will, or the smaller, the less well known guest will actually do a lot of social media promotion and promote it to their email list, that sort of thing.
It's good advice, which kind of goes into the next one. Are there some favorite tips that you have for preparing for a podcast interview? I mean, you talked about checking their audio and doing some research on them. So there are other things on top of that?
Yeah, so I'd say as a guest, you want to listen to parts of the shows, even if you don't have time to listen to a few hours of the show. Sometimes, especially if you're going on a big podcast, they sometimes have this one big question they ask at the end, right? So how I built this with Guy Raz, you know, always at the end, he says, okay, so how much of this would you attribute to luck, your success to luck, and how much to, you know, hard work? And, you know, you look kind of silly if you don't know, if you're not prepared for that question, if you will. But you can also understand a little bit about the interview style and that sort of thing. So listening to a little bit of it, and then also understand what you want to get across. It's good, especially if you haven't talked on the topic a lot, to have some bullet points, maybe to the side of your monitor where you're like, okay, these are my talking points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that I really want to get across to this audience. And that way it's kind of your cheat sheet, right?
Yeah.
So if you get stuck on something, you have something you can refer to. So
I definitely have one just to the right of my screen right now, just to make sure I stay on topic. Stay on topic. I am useless without it. That is for sure. So,
right.
so what are some big mistakes that you hear new podcasters make repeatedly that you just wish they knew about, and how do they go about fixing those?
Yeah. So there, a lot of people, and I'm guilty of this, they get stuck on this kind of analysis paralysis, wanting to make it perfect before they go to market with their podcast. And so before I started mine, I did all this research on audio setups, on I hired someone to do a voiceover intro, and I did all these things, which really set me back a couple months on getting started, because I just wanted to do it right. And I guess the first thing I urge people to do is just get it out there, and you'll see where it goes. You'll listen to some episodes, you'll get feedback on the audio quality, and you might only need a $40, $50 microphone, depending on your setup. And, I canned that voiceover. It ended up being kind of cheesy, right? And so after, about a year, I just changed that, and I just have a soft music intro, that I then go right into. You can do it either way, but I guess you don't need to go out and do all those things before you get started. The main thing I tell people to do before they get started is invest a little bit of money in getting good cover art. So this cover art is what people see when they go through their podcast app and they're deciding if they want to open it up and listen to your podcast or subscribe. And if it's kind of like a book, right? You wouldn't create this great book and then put a shabby cover on it. Same thing with this. And it's even more important, I would say, to have cover art that looks professional, or at least is on brand and doesn't look like you scribbled it in Microsoft Paint, if that's still a thing. I'm dating myself now, but I would, you can get something okay on Fiverr for 10, 15 bucks. I spent, I think, a few $100s on mine, and it was just well worth it. The attention to detail, the quality, something that really stands out. That and getting a decent microphone are what I would spend my money on before getting started. I see some podcasters that use podcastguests.com that say, oh, I haven't launched yet, but I have 20 interviews in the can ready to go. And I'm like, well, what are you waiting for? Get it out there. Because you need to learn from your audience feedback on what it is they want to hear. And then also getting guests to go on a show that hasn't launched yet is much harder, right? They want to hear it. They want to see that it has some continuity to it, some longevity to it. A lot of podcasters record a few podcasts and then they give up because they realize it's a lot more work than they thought.
It is a lot of work.
Seeing someone out there, right, with 10, 20, or in my case, a few hundred episodes, you know that person's not going to suddenly shut it down and you're going to have wasted your time. Yeah.
So true. So do you have any other projects that you've got going in the works right now that you can discuss with us? Anything new going on?
No, I focus on my domain name blog and then on podcast guests, and podcastguests.com has really taken off during the pandemic. And so I've been focusing a lot more time on it. I think because everyone's stuck at home, they can't go meet one-on-one. Like a record number of podcasts have been started over the past few months. And then also people that usually meet people at trade shows and market themselves that way, they can't do it right now. And so there's just a lot of activity around it. So I'm focusing a lot of time on making sure I grow that and cultivate the community.
Yeah, definitely a good opportunity right now for anybody doing podcasts. So how does somebody determine if doing a podcast is right for them, the right move for them or their business?
Right. So I guess the first thing I'd say is before you start a podcast, be a guest on some podcasts, because you'll realize that even though being the guest is the easy part, because you don't have to do all this post-production, recording, all that sort of stuff, scheduling, it still takes some work, right? Being a guest, being prepared, those sorts of things. And so I'd be a guest on a few shows before you start your own podcast. That way you'll understand a little bit about the work behind it before you get going.
Well, and then be able to be in their shoes too and see what your guest is going to go through and be able to do things to make it easier for the guests.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a good point. And then I think, understand what you want to get out of it. I said earlier, if your goal is to get hundreds of thousands of downloads and advertisers, odds are it's not going to happen. And so I would go into it understanding, setting a realistic expectations, understanding how you're going to build your audience. It's slow. It's not like Google, where you can put a piece of content up, and if it's got the right keywords and a few people link to it, all of a sudden you get a lot of traffic. Podcasts are much slower growth. And although it's getting better, discoverability is getting better, it's still, it's one of those things where you build an audience over time that grows organically from people listening and from being a guest on other shows, which is something you have to do a lot to grow your show.
Yeah.
These are things that you should take into consideration. So I would strongly think about what you want to get out of it and how realistic that is before you start.
That's good. So if somebody was to go down the podcast road, what in your opinion is the most important of content consistency? Like, is it daily, weekly, monthly, those kind of things?
Well, the key is that word you use, consistency. And so if you do it weekly, you want to publish once a week, same time, same day, every week.
My next question though. So what do you do when your internet goes down and
Yeah. And so here's the thing, when you're dealing with the internet, and everyone knows this, right? Everyone working from home right now, you have issues that come up. And the good thing to me is to have a good editor, or if you do it yourself, know how to do it. And that's one of the things I outsourced, because I researched it and I thought there are better things I can do with my time than edit my own podcast. So I hired someone to do that. And I always tell people, if someone comes to the door and the dog barks like crazy, just hold on, and then we'll repeat it. We'll stitch it together. Everything will be okay.
Yeah. I'm glad that doesn't just happen to me, because
no, yeah, it happens to everyone.
Darn UPS guy.
Yeah, and it puts people at ease too, knowing that it can be edited out. They're less concerned with perfect as well.
For sure. And if you're like me and you've got kids at home that are eating up all the bandwidth with their Xbox games.
You have to tell them to get offline for an hour while you're recording your podcast.
And tell them you will not die in 1 hour. I promise.
Yes,
they will all be there when you get back. So has there been for you as a podcast host a memorable episode that you've had or an experience that's popped up along the way? Having over 300 episodes, I'm sure you've got some stories there.
Yeah, I've interviewed some interesting people. Some of the more interesting ones I've interviewed, Matt Mullenweg, who created WordPress.
Okay.
And then for my industry, the guy who kind of invented the DNS, the domain name system. So I would say yes. I've done so many that it's hard they all kind of blur together. But it's interesting too. Some of the ones that I get, I hang up and I'm like, well, that was okay. That was fine. I get the most positive feedback from, right? And some of the ones I'm like, oh, that was perfect. That was the greatest guest, I don't hear much from. So, you want to listen to the feedback from your audience and find more guests or more content, if you're not doing a guest approach, that your audience cares about and likes, rather than just you, right? So, granted, you do have to care about what you're talking about, or it'll show, especially with all the work that's involved. But
so very true. So has there been any faux pas, any crazy mishaps that has happened along the way with having your own podcast?
Right. I would say the worst feeling, and this has happened to me probably 3 times in my 300 episodes, is where something goes wrong with the recording. And you have to get back to the guest and say, I know you spent 40 minutes with me this morning. How would you like to do it again? That was a practice run.
I literally had to do that 2 weeks ago, like Zoom call. I got the email from Zoom. They're like, here's the link to your episode. And I click on it and it's like error. I'm like, well, what do you mean error? I'm like, what, where did it go? So we're redoing it next week.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and hopefully the person will sound that much better. So, the nice thing with Zoom is that, the guest can see, I see in the corner of my screen that it's recording. So it's not like you forgot to hit record. And sometimes if I don't see that on Zoom, I'm like, have you hit record yet?
Yeah.
But I've had just not my fault, software fault, just like you're talking about. And it's,
it sucks, but
yeah, it is, there's nothing you can do about it as long as you have your system in place. I mean, you can do a backup recording mechanism, but that can have issues too.
Yeah, so true. And it just bogs everything down because then you've got two systems running at the same time, and talk about internet issues like we had just a minute ago. Golly. Right. So one of the last questions I always like asking, is there anything that you're currently reading, listening to? Is there a favorite podcast you have right now?
Recently I started listening to a couple. One is called You're Wrong About. And it's two co-hosts. It's not sometimes they have guests, but they talk about all these things that, we remember how the media covered it. And then they basically break down the myths behind it. It's fun. It's interesting. Some of the topics they go through that are from like my childhood, right? Like stranger danger type things, and how, there really was very little stranger danger, and these stories get magnified. If you like comedy, Mike Birbiglia has a new podcast out called Working It Out, where he talks to these other great comedians like John Mulaney. And it's like, hey, what are some jokes you're working on? And then they talk about their process and that sort of thing. And
that would be interesting.
Yeah, I like going to live comedy shows, which you can't do right now. And so it's just kind of a lot of fun. And all these podcasts are free. It's this amazing content you can go listen to without paying a dime.
Free entertainment.
And it's free entertainment. So, I love listening to business shows and ones that are interesting to me from that perspective. It's also great to just go out there and look at what's new and find some of these kind of esoteric niche things like domain names, that, you might find yourself very much interested in. So.
I have to say, that's probably the last thing I expected you to say was a podcast on domain name. Like, really? How much can you talk? Apparently you can talk a lot about it.
You can talk a lot about it, and 1,500 people will be very interested in what you have to say. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So one last question that just pops into my mind. Sure. Coronavirus is ended. Everything goes back to normal. Where's the first place you're going?
Oh man, out to eat. Just out to eat. My wife and I, the other day, we went to a restaurant where we used to eat, every few weeks, sit down, and we ordered to-go food, and they had a patio there, and we just sat on the patio eating out of our to-go packages, just so we could be eating somewhere out of the house. So yep, that's what I'm most looking forward to.
Yeah, definitely. We love our restaurants. Isn't that the truth? So, well, Andrew, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast, teaching us more about how to become a podcaster, how to be a better guest, and all that stuff. So I've appreciated your time. My pleasure. Thanks for having me on. All right, guys, we'll see you next Tuesday.
You've been listening to the Digital Agency Insiders Podcast. For more tutorials on growing your digital marketing agency, make sure to visit digitalagencyinsiders.com.